Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Millhaven County, Pennsylvania, that has ever been recorded. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and when you first heard this story. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. In the fall of 1888, Millhaven County had an unusual chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the countryside. The towns where coal is mined are spread out across. The rolling hills of western Pennsylvania were used to harsh winters. That year, though, something different happened. A cold that felt like it was meant to be, like it was personal. People who live in Cedar Ridge, a small town between the Allegheny foothills and the Yohogany River. Not many people paid much attention to the small ad that ran in the Weekly Gazette on October 15th. Fine winter clothes, well made, and reasonably priced. Ask at the Hemlock Cottage, which is a mile north of Bridge by Miller. The ad just said, "See Moravec." Most people in the area knew it was about Cordelia Moravec, a Czech immigrant who had moved to Cedar Ridge 3 years before after her husband died in a mining accident near Pittsburgh. The ad wasn't interesting because of its low-key tone or promise of low prices. What made it stand out was the amazing quality of the clothes that Mrs. Moravec had started making that season. According to records kept by Jeremiah Caldwell, the owner and operator of the Cedar Ridge General Store, the first customers to visit Mrs. Moravec's cottage came back with coats that had never been seen in the area before. The materials looked like some kind of fur, but no one could tell what kind of animal it came from. The pelts were very soft and had a strange shine that changed from deep brown to almost black, depending on how you looked at them. What was even more surprising was how warm these clothes were. Provided a heat that seemed to come from the material itself, so you didn't need to wear layers underneath even on the coldest days. There was a winding dirt path that led to Miss Moravec's cottage. It was at the end of the path that branched off from the main road to Miller's Bridge. The building itself wasn't very interesting. A single-story house made of local fieldstone and with a slate roof, which is typical of the area's simple architecture. The property had a large workshop shed behind the main house, which was what set it apart. Mrs. Moravec built it herself during her first year of living there. Neighbors sometimes saw smoke coming from the shed's chimney at all hours, even late at night. However, the smell that came on the wind was not like that of burning wood or coal. Some people said it was sweet, almost like flowers, while others said they could smell something that reminded them of leather being cured. Reverend Ezekiel wrote the first letter that we know of that raised concerns about Mrs. Moravec's business practices. Whitmore wrote to his sister in Philadelphia on November 2, 1888. Reverend Whitmore was the pastor of the Methodist Church in Cedar Ridge. He wrote long letters to the church about the spiritual and social conditions in his community. In this letter that the Philadelphia Methodist Historical Society keeps in its archives, he wrote, "I confess myself troubled by the manner in which our Mrs. Moravec conducts her trade. While I cannot fault the quality of her work, indeed several of my parishioners have purchased her clothes and talk about how great they are, there is something about how she does things that makes me think twice. She insists on meeting with each customer alone, often for more than 2 hours. When I asked about this, she said that proper fitting requires careful measurement and consideration of each customer's specific needs. But I have noticed that people who go to her cottage often come out looking different. Not sick, exactly, but subdued in a way that seems strange to me." The Reverend's observations were shared by others in the community, though few spoke openly about their concerns. According to oral histories collected by historian Marjorie Fenwick in 1952, several residents of Cedar Ridge noted that customers of Mrs. Moravec's workshop began exhibiting peculiar behaviors following their visits. They became more withdrawn, less inclined to participate in community gatherings, and seemed to prefer solitary activities. Most notably, they displayed an unusual. People loved their new clothes so much that they wore them all the time, no matter what the weather was like or how appropriate it was for them to do so. Barnabas Hutchkins, a local farmer and regular customer at Caldwell's General Store, was one of the first people to buy one of Mrs. Moravick's coats. Hutchkins had farmed the same plot of land near Cedar Ridge for more than 20 years and was known for being practical and hard-working. His wife Temperance's diary, which was found during the estate sale after her death in. Barnabas went to Mrs. Moravick's cottage on October 20th, 1888, to get a warm coat for the winter. Temperance's entries from this time show how things changed slowly after her husband bought the coat. For example, her entry from October 22nd says, "Barnabas came back yesterday evening with the most beautiful coat I have ever seen. The fur is a type I don't know, but it's soft like a rabbit and has the same depth of color as a mink. Animal from which it came, he said only that Mrs. Moravick explained it was a European variety uncommon in this region. He has scarcely removed the garment since bringing it home, even wearing it to bed last night despite the warmth of our bedroom." By November, Temperance's entries reveal growing concern about her husband's behavior. Barnabas has become increasingly distant. He completes his farm duties but speaks little, even during meals. Most disturbing is his insistence on visiting Mrs. Moravick's cottage every Wednesday evening. When I ask about these visits, he says they discuss proper care of the garment, though such conversations surely require less than the 3 hours he spends there each week. I have begun to fear that the widow has some hold over him, though I cannot imagine what form such influence might take. The pattern observed in Barnabas Hutchkins was repeated among other customers of Mrs. Moravick's workshop. Isadora Fleming, wife of the local bank president, purchased a coat in Early. Cottage every Wednesday evening. When I ask about these visits, he says they discuss proper care of the garment, though such conversations surely require less than the 3 hours he spends there each week. I have begun to fear that the widow has some hold over him, though I cannot imagine what form such influence might take. The pattern observed in Barnabas Hutchkins was repeated among other customers of Mrs. Moravick's workshop. Isadora Fleming, wife of the local bank president, purchased a coat in Early. November, and then started turning down social invitations, preferring to spend her time alone in her parlor. Cornelius Blackwater, who owned the county's largest farm, bought a coat for his wife Prudence. Within a month, neighbors noticed that he had lost a lot of weight and had started walking alone along the riverbank during the coldest hours of the night. The workshop behind Mrs. Morav's cottage became a source of particular curiosity and concern among Cedar Ridge residents. Those who passed. People who walked by the property at night said they saw shadows moving behind the curtains, even though Mrs. Moravick said she lived alone. The smoke that came out of the building's chimney had a strange, sweet smell that seemed to get stronger at certain times of the moon, especially during the new moon when the workshop seemed to be the busiest. Dr. Sylvanus Heath, the only doctor in Cedar Ridge and the surrounding townships, began to notice changes in some of his patients in the last few months of 1888. His medical journal, given to the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1941, has entries that describe a variety of symptoms among people who bought clothes from Mrs. Moravick's workshop. Patients said their circulation improved and they became less sensitive to cold, which Dr. Heath initially thought was because the coats were better insulated. However, other symptoms were harder to explain. Several patients had big changes in their appetite, such as not wanting to eat meat that had previously been their favorite food. Others became more sensitive to bright light and started asking for evening appointments for routine medical consultations. Perhaps most concerning to Dr. Heath was that multiple patients began expressing a desire to visit Mrs. Morav's cottage more frequently than their original purpose would suggest. When questioned about these visits, patients offered vague explanations about garment maintenance or discussions about additional. Patients who had previously preferred meat as their main food began to develop an unusual sensitivity to bright light and started asking for evening appointments for routine medical consultations. Dr. Heath was most worried that multiple patients began to express a desire to visit Mrs. Morav's cottage more often than their original purpose would suggest. When questioned about these visits, patients offered vague explanations about garment maintenance or discussions about additional purchases. But few people seemed to buy anything new on these repeated trips. The mystery surrounding Mrs. Moravec's materials deepened when Jeremiah Caldwell tried to find out where she got her supplies. Caldwell, who owned the general store that served the whole area, had connections with merchants and suppliers all over Pennsylvania and neighboring states. He made discreet inquiries about exotic fur traders, European importers, and specialty textile merchants, but none of them could identify the type of material used in Mrs. Moravec's garments. In December 1888, Caldwell approached Mrs. Moravec directly, ostensibly to discuss the possibility of carrying her products in his store. According to his own account recorded in a letter to his brother in Baltimore, the conversation proved deeply unsettling. The woman received me cordially enough, though her manner was strange. She spoke in whispers, even when we were quite alone, and seemed constantly aware of sounds that I could not detect. When I asked her about her suppliers, her whole face changed. She said that her materials came from family sources in the old country and were passed down through generations. But when I asked for more information, she became evasive and finally said that some information was too dangerous to share freely. What bothered Caldwell most about the visit was Mrs. Morav's workshop. She only showed him the front room where she met with customers, but he could see into the back room through a partially. When he opened the door, he saw that the space beyond was filled with what looked like large vats or containers. The air smelled like the rendering facility near the slaughterhouse in Pittsburgh. When he told Mrs. Moravec about this, she quickly closed the door and said that the materials in the back workshop were sensitive to exposure and needed to be handled with care. By January 1889, the strange atmosphere around Mrs. Morav's business had begun to affect the larger community. Her regular customers had become a closed group that often met at each other's homes, but stayed away from larger community events. They seemed to talk to each other through glances and small gestures that left out non-C customers, creating an unspoken divide in Cedar Ridge society. The situation got worse when several families said that their relatives who owned Mrs. Moravec's clothes had started having trouble sleeping. Temperance Hutchkins wrote in her diary. Barnabas had gotten into the habit of getting up in the middle of the night and going outside, sometimes not coming back until dawn. One time, when she followed him, she saw him standing still in their yard, facing Mrs. Moravec's cottage for hours, even though it was very cold. Other families reported similar things. Spouses and relatives said that their loved ones acted like they were in a trance at night, always while wearing there. Some were found standing in gardens or fields, while others were slowly walking along the river path that led to Mrs. Moravec's property. All of them were perfectly still and didn't seem to notice the cold, wind, or rain. Dr. Heath wrote about these events in his medical journal, at first thinking they were some kind of sleepwalking disorder. However, the way the movements were coordinated and purposeful made it seem like they were conscious rather than wandering around. More puzzling was the fact that when they were woken up or asked questions, the people who were affected had no memory of leaving their homes and seemed genuinely confused about being outside. The breakthrough in understanding Mrs. Moravec's operation came from an unexpected source. a traveling merchant named Moray Steenberg, who passed through Cedar Ridge in February 1889. Steenberg traded in exotic goods and unusual materials throughout the eastern states, and had extensive knowledge of rare textiles and animal products. When Jeremiah Caldwell showed Steenberg examples of Mrs. Moravec's work, and his reaction was immediate and alarming. Caldwell said that Steenberg looked at the clothes very carefully before saying that the material was unlike anything he had ever seen. The texture and properties suggested fur from a large mammal, but the hair structure and follicle patterns were not consistent with any known species. What was most disturbing was Steenberg's observation that the material seemed to keep some form of cellular activity, as shown by small changes in color and texture when exposed to body heat. Steenberg's expertise led him to a conclusion that Caldwell initially thought was impossible. The materials used in Mrs. Moravec's clothes were not from animals at all. They looked like processed human hair that had been treated in some unknown way to look and feel like fur. When asked for proof of this strange claim, Steenberg pointed to microscopic features that could be seen. He only saw patterns of growth and cellular structure that he said were consistent with human rather than animal origins when he looked at them closely. This new information made Mrs. Moravec's operation look completely different and horrifying. If Steenberg's analysis was correct, the materials used in her clothes came from sources that were too disturbing to think about directly. The amount of hair needed to make even one coat would require the complete harvesting from multiple human sources. But there had been no reports of missing people in Cedar Ridge or the nearby towns. Jeremiah Caldwell was in a tough spot. Steenberg's claims suggested the worst kind of criminal activity, but there was no direct evidence to back them up. Mrs. Moravec kept running her business openly. Her customers were happy with their purchases, and there were no obvious crimes in the community. Still, Caldwell felt he had to share his worries. Cedar Ridge and the surrounding township's constable was Cyrus Whitman, a retired Army sergeant who had held that position for 15 years. Whitman was known for his practical approach to law enforcement and his reluctance to pursue investigations based on speculation or community rumors. When Caldwell showed him Steenberg's assessment of Mrs. Moravec's materials, Whitman was skeptical at first. However, he agreed to conduct a discreet investigation of Mrs. Moravec's activities. His methodical and careful approach was meant to gather information without letting Mrs. Moravec know that the government was interested in her business. He started by looking through records from nearby communities for reports of missing persons, especially those that might have happened while Mrs. Moravec lived in Cedar Ridge. He also asked questions about her background in an effort to confirm her claims about inheriting money from family members in Europe. The investigation turned up several concerning. There were inconsistencies in Mrs. Moravec's history. Records from the mining company that employed her late husband did not mention a Cordelia Moravec or any death benefits paid to such a widow. Immigration records from the port of Philadelphia did not show anyone matching her description during the time she said she arrived in America. Whitman's discovery that similar businesses had operated in other communities throughout Pennsylvania was even more troubling. In the 1880s, a woman who looked a lot like Mrs. Moravec set up a textile workshop in a nearby state that made unusual fur clothing. The business did well for a few years, but then the woman vanished without a trace, leaving no forwarding address or explanation for her departure. The pattern was very consistent. The businesses always started in remote rural areas with limited communication with larger cities, and always focused on a specific type of fur clothing with. Unusual properties and always attracted a devoted customer base that exhibited similar behavioral changes. Most significantly, each community reported a slight but noticeable increase in missing persons cases during the period of operation, though these disappearances were typically attributed to the transient nature of rural populations rather than criminal activity. Armed with this information, Constable Whitman decided to conduct a direct investigation of Mrs. Moravec's property. Pennsylvania law permitted. Peace officers could look around a business if they had a good reason to think something illegal was going on. Whitman was careful to make it clear that he was only there to ask about business licensing, not to investigate a crime. When he arrived at Mrs. Moravec's cottage on March 15, 1889, she was polite, but clearly nervous. She quickly led him into the front part of her workshop, where she did customer fittings and kept finished clothes. This area looked. There was nothing about the place that looked suspicious, and it was clean, organized, and normal in every way. However, when Whitman asked to see the back workshop area, Mrs. Moravec got upset. She said that the space had materials that were dangerous to handle improperly, and that exposure to certain chemicals used in her processing methods could make people sick if they weren't trained. When Whitman insisted that his investigation needed full access to the premises, Mrs. Moravec. He reluctantly agreed, but insisted on going with him to make sure nothing was disturbed. The back workshop was nothing like what Whitman had expected. Instead of the large vats or rendering equipment that had been described earlier, the space was filled with what looked like a complicated laboratory. Tables lined the walls, covered with glass containers, measuring instruments, and equipment that looked more like medical equipment than textile machinery. The sweet smell that neighbors had noticed was stronger here, coming from many sealed jars containing what looked like different chemical solutions. The most disturbing thing was a series of detailed diagrams mounted on the walls that showed what looked like anatomical studies of human hair growth patterns, cellular structures, and processing methods. The level of scientific detail suggested expertise far beyond what would be expected from a simple garment maker, indicating knowledge of chemistry, biology, and medical procedures that would require. The smell was stronger here, coming from a lot of sealed jars that looked like they contained different chemical solutions. The most disturbing thing was a series of detailed diagrams on the walls that looked like they were showing anatomical studies of how human hair grows, how cells are structured, and how to process hair. The level of scientific detail suggested expertise far beyond what would be expected from a simple garment maker, indicating knowledge of chemistry, biology, and medical procedures that would require formal training. Mrs. Moravec said that the equipment was necessary for her specialized processing methods, and that turning raw materials into the finished fur-like texture required careful chemical treatment and precise temperature control. When Whitman asked her about her training in such technical procedures, she repeated her earlier claims about family knowledge passed down through generations, but her explanations became less clear and more contradictory. The most disturbing, Whitman discovered the storage area where Mrs. Morav kept her raw materials. There were large wooden containers that held what looked like bundles of hair in different stages of processing. The amount was huge, as if it had been gathered from hundreds of sources. When asked where these materials came from, Mrs. Moravec said they were imported from European suppliers who specialized in collecting hair from willing donors, but she couldn't provide any proof of this. Purchases or importation. Whitman's examination of the hair itself revealed characteristics that supported Steinberg's earlier assessment. The color variations, length patterns, and cellular structure were inconsistent with any animal fur, but matched human hair in all observable aspects. Most troubling was the fact that many of the bundles appeared to have been removed from the source quite recently, showing no signs of the deterioration that would be expected from material stored for extended periods. The investigation took. Things took a big turn when Whitman found a hidden compartment under the workshop floor. The space held detailed records of Mrs. Moravec's customers, but these documents showed information that had never been asked for during normal business transactions. Customer profiles included physical descriptions, personal habits, family relationships, and what looked like schedules of daily activities, which suggested that the surveillance went beyond simple business interests. Among these records were detailed maps of the area around it, marking certain places with symbols that matched up with individual customer profiles. Many of these places seemed to be hidden spots along the river in wooded areas or near abandoned mining sites. When these were compared to the customer surveillance records, a disturbing pattern emerged. Customers were being tracked, their movements watched, and their access to remote areas carefully recorded. The last piece of evidence came from A. Whitman found a journal written in a language he couldn't understand, but it had detailed drawings that made it clear what Mrs. Moravec was really doing. The drawings showed people in different states, processes that looked like they were systematically collecting hair, and what looked like ways to get rid of bodies. The level of detail and clinical accuracy suggested that the author had a lot of experience with these kinds of things. Whitman immediately called the police in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia for help. However, when investigators arrived from the city 3 days later, they found Mrs. Moravec's cottage empty. She had left during the night after Whitman's investigation, taking all of her portable equipment and materials with her, but leaving behind the built-in equipment that would have been too big to move easily. The investigation of the abandoned workshop revealed more evidence. That confirmed the worst fears about what Mrs. Moravec was up to. Investigators found a carefully built disposal system under the building that led to an underground chamber connected to the nearby river by a series of drainage channels. The chamber had evidence of organic materials that had been processed through what looked like an acid-based decomposition system, leaving behind only mineral residues and trace elements that needed to be analyzed in a lab to be identified. Chemical tests on the remains found in the disposal chamber confirmed that they were human, but it was impossible to tell who they were because the processing had been so thorough. Estimates suggested that materials from dozens of sources had been processed through the system during Mrs. Moravec's time in Cedar Ridge. However, local missing person reports could only explain a small part of this number. The investigation then looked into the changes in Mrs. Moravec's customers during her time in business. Dr. Heath's medical records were very important because they showed that the clothes had been treated with chemicals that made people who wore them feel different. Chemical tests of fabric samples showed that they contained chemicals that could make people feel like they were in a trance, make them less aware of their surroundings, and make them move without thinking about it toward certain places at night. The fact that Mrs. Moravec had been. Using her customers as unwitting accomplices in her operation added another layer of horror to the case. The midnight wanderings that families had seen were not random behavior, but programmed responses designed to bring victims to predetermined locations where they could be harvested without resistance. The gradual isolation of customers from community activities had been intended to reduce the likelihood that absences would be noticed or investigated. Recovery of customers from the effects of the treated garments proved to be a long process. Dr. Heath wrote that people still had compulsive behaviors weeks after they stopped wearing the contaminated clothes. Some people never fully recovered their old personalities and stayed withdrawn, with permanent changes in their sleep patterns, appetite, and social interactions. The psychological trauma of realizing their unconscious participation in Mrs. Moravec's activities affected several customers so severely that they required permanent medical supervision. The investigation also revealed that Cedar Ridge had not been Mrs. Moravec's first or only location of operation. Coordination with authorities in other states uncovered a trail of similar businesses spanning nearly a decade, always following the same pattern of establishment, operation, and sudden abandonment. The total scope of her activities suggested that hundreds of victims had been processed through her system across multiple communities, making her among the most prolific criminals in American history. Even though law enforcement agencies in several states worked hard to find or catch Mrs. Moravec, they were never able to do so. During her time in Cedar Ridge, her descriptions were so carefully controlled that even regular customers could only give vague details about her appearance. She seemed to know a lot about how to investigate crimes, and had set up her identity and business in a way that made it less likely that she would be found or pursued. The case was still open in Pennsylvania. State records existed until 1954, but active investigations stopped after 1892. Periodic reports suggested possible sightings of similar operations in remote areas of the Western Territories, but none could be confirmed or definitively linked to the same person. The development of more advanced criminal investigation techniques and better communication between law enforcement agencies made it harder for Moravec to run his operations without being caught. County officials tore down the building that had housed Mrs. Moravec's operation in 1890. They said the site was not suitable for residential construction because of contamination from the chemical processing that had taken place there. The property remained empty until 1923, when it was turned into farmland after extensive soil treatment to remove toxic residues. Local residents continued to avoid the area, and the land changed hands several times before finally being incorporated into a larger farm operation in the 1940s. Pennsylvania state authorities kept physical evidence from Mrs. Moravec's workshop and eventually gave it to the newly formed Federal Bureau of Investigation for their criminal methodology studies. The case became part of training materials for investigators who specialize in serial crimes and was used as an example of the advanced methods that criminals could use in small, isolated communities with few resources. Communication infrastructure. The psychological impact of the Mrs. Moravec case on the Cedar Ridge community persisted for decades after her disappearance. Many families relocated to other regions, unable to remain in an area associated with such horrific discoveries. Those who stayed found that community social patterns had been permanently altered by the revelation that neighbors had been unknowingly participating in criminal activities. Trust between residents required years to rebuild, and the community never became as close-knit as it had been before 1888. Dr. Heath continued to treat former customers of Mrs. Moravec's business until he retired in 1912. His detailed medical records of their recovery gave important information about the long-term effects of chemical manipulation and psychological trauma, which helped people understand what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of his patients never fully recovered their previous mental state, which required. Jeremiah's case also led to changes in how businesses are licensed and overseen in rural Pennsylvania communities. Local authorities were given more power to inspect businesses, especially those that used new materials or processing methods. To stop similar businesses from starting up without proper oversight, the requirements for documenting supply sources and processing procedures were made stricter. Caldwell, whose investigation ultimately led to the discovery of Mrs. Moravec's activities, never fully recovered from his knowledge of the case. According to family correspondence preserved in the Cedar Ridge Historical Society, he suffered from persistent nightmares and developed an obsessive concern about the safety of community members. He eventually sold his general store and relocated to Ohio, where he lived quietly until his death in 1919. Constable Cyrus Whitman received commendation from state authorities for his investigation of the case, but the experience marked the end of his career in law enforcement. He resigned his position 6 months after Mrs. Moravec's disappearance, stating that the case had revealed criminal possibilities he was not equipped to handle. He spent his remaining years as a farmer, avoiding any involvement in legal or investigative activities. The broader implications of the Mrs. Moravec case extended beyond the immediate criminal investigation to influence academic study of criminal behavior and community. Security. Criminologists who looked into the case said that the isolation and poor communication systems in rural areas made them easy targets for criminals who were willing to put in the time and effort to plan and carry out such an operation. The case helped make the case for better transportation and communication infrastructure to make remote areas safer. Historical analysis of the case also showed how much planning and scientific knowledge were needed to pull off such an operation. Mrs. Moravec had shown knowledge of chemistry, psychology, anatomy, and criminal methodology that was much more advanced than what her background would suggest. This made people wonder if she had worked alone or as part of a larger criminal group with access to specialized knowledge and resources. Despite a lot of investigation by many law enforcement agencies, the mystery of Mrs. Moravec's true identity was never solved. There were no records of her in immigration documents, schools, or professional organizations that might have given her the scientific knowledge she showed. Her ability to run such a complicated operation without being caught suggested either exceptional individual skill or help from sources that were never found. In 1965, while workers were fixing up an old building in Pittsburgh, they found papers that seemed to be connected to Mrs. Moravec's activities. The papers had chemical formulas, processing procedures, and references to other places where similar operations might have taken place. However, the documents had deteriorated badly during their decades of storage, and much of the information was illegible or incomplete. What could be recovered supported earlier evidence about the scope and sophistication of her criminal enterprise, but provided no new leads for identifying or locating her. The Cedar Ridge community gradually. People in the area got over the trauma of the Mrs. Moravec case, but the memory of what happened affected local culture for generations. Families passed down stories about the case, which often got twisted or exaggerated in the telling, but they still had the same basic warning about trusting strangers who offered goods that seemed too good to be true. The case became part of local folklore, serving as a warning about the dangers that could be hidden behind seemingly innocent commercial transactions. Activities. Modern criminal investigators studying historical cases continue to find the Mrs. Moravec operation remarkable for its sophisticated combination of scientific knowledge, psychological manipulation, and systematic planning. The case demonstrates how criminal activities could be sustained over extended periods in pre-modern communication environments using isolation and limited information sharing to prevent detection. The methods she employed anticipated techniques that would later be associated with more contemporary criminal organizations, suggesting either exceptional innovation or access to knowledge that was far ahead of its time. The chemical processes used to create the garments that formed the centerpiece of Mrs. Moravec's operation were never fully understood despite extensive analysis of recovered materials. The combination of human hair treatment, psychological manipulation compounds, and textile processing methods represented a level of technical sophistication that challenged the scientific understanding of the period. It wasn't until advances in organic chemistry and neuroscience that some parts of her method were fully explained. What was most disturbing was the realization that Mrs. Moravec's operation had been designed not just to find victims to process, but to create a system that could last forever without being noticed. This involved psychologically conditioning customers, systematically watching community members, and carefully planning how to get rid of bodies. Indicated long-term thinking that suggested she had intended to operate in Cedar Ridge for many years, rather than the brief period that actually occurred. Only Constable Whitman's investigation had disrupted what appeared to be a perfectly planned criminal enterprise. The broader question of how many similar operations might have existed during the same period remained unanswered. The limited communication and investigation capabilities of late 19th century law enforcement meant that criminal activities in remote areas often went unnoticed or were blamed on natural causes or accidents. Mrs. Moravec's sophisticated method suggested that other criminals might have been running similar businesses without ever being caught or recorded. Records from the time show that several other communities reported strange business operations, using strange materials or processing methods that made high-quality products with questionable origins. Most of these reports were. People thought they were just local rumors or gossip, but looking back, some of them might have been signs of criminal activity, like what happened in Cedar Ridge. Because law enforcement agencies didn't share information in a systematic way, it was unlikely that patterns that crossed over into multiple communities would be noticed or looked into. The case files about Mrs. Moravec's business eventually became part of the research collection kept by the Federal Bureau of. The investigation was done for training and historical purposes. The evidence was too disturbing, and the criminal methods used in the case were too detailed for anyone to see. Researchers looking into old crime patterns or early investigative techniques could get permission to look at the files, but public access was limited to protect the families of people who were affected by the original events. The physical evidence found in Mrs. Moravec's workshop was kept by federal authorities until the 1960s, when most materials were destroyed according to standard evidence disposal procedures. However, some samples of the treated garments and chemical processing materials were preserved for ongoing research into criminal methodology and toxicology. These samples occasionally provided valuable reference materials for investigators dealing with similar cases involving chemical manipulation of materials or psychological conditioning of victims. The psychological profiles, developed during the investigation of Mrs. Moravec's customers, provided early insights into the effects of prolonged exposure to behavior-modifying substances and the recovery process from such conditioning. Dr. Heath's detailed medical records became part of the foundational research used to understand how chemical agents could be used to control human behavior without the conscious awareness of victims. This research contributed to later developments in forensic psychology and the treatment of victims in cases of systematic psychological manipulation. The Cedar Ridge community never fully returned to its pre-1888 character. It continued to exist as a viable settlement for several more decades, but the population gradually declined as families moved away and fewer new residents chose to settle in an area associated with such notorious events. By the 1920s, Cedar Ridge had become little more than a collection of scattered farms, and the original town center had largely disappeared. The area was eventually added to nearby towns, and the name Cedar Ridge fell out of use. The site of Mrs. Moravec's cottage became the subject of local superstition and folklore for many years after she disappeared. Even though it was cleared and turned into farmland, people still reported strange things happening in the area, like unexplained smells, especially the sweet smell that had been in her workshop, and sounds that made it sound like someone was there when it was empty. These reports were mostly thought to be the result of psychological effects of the community trauma, not real strange events. Modern farming on the old cottage site required a lot of work to clean up the soil because of the chemical pollution that Mrs. Moravec's processing operations left behind. Soil samples taken during the 1940s conversion showed higher levels of different chemicals that had been used in her textile processing methods. The cleanup required removing several feet of contaminated soil and replacing it with clean material before the land could be safely used for crop production. The river path that Mrs. Moravec's conditioned customers had walked during their nighttime episodes became known locally as the Widow's Trail and was generally avoided by residents for decades after her disappearance. The path eventually became overgrown and impassable, though portions of it remained visible until development of the area in the mid-nth century. Some sections of the original path were incorporated into modern recreational trails, though few current users are aware of the historical significance of the route. As Pennsylvania's rural communities modernized and became better connected to urban centers, the type of isolation that had allowed Mrs. Moravec to operate undetected became increasingly rare. Improved transportation, communication systems, and law enforcement coordination made it much more difficult for criminals to establish long-term operations in remote areas without attracting attention. The Mrs. Moravec case became part of the historical record of a time when such criminal enterprises were technically possible in ways that would be almost impossible today. And yet, even now, more than 100 years after these events happened in the hills of western Pennsylvania, there are still questions about the true scope and nature of Mrs. Moravec's operations. The sophisticated methods, scientific expertise, and systematic approach to victim selection and processing all point to capabilities and knowledge that challenge our understanding of criminal activities in that period. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that her success depended not on elaborate technology or large-scale organization, but simply on the trust of rural communities and the isolation that allowed terrible secrets to remain hidden for far too long. Some historians who have studied the case suggest that the real lesson is not about the crimes themselves, but about how easily evil can disguise itself as commerce, how readily people can be manipulated when their basic needs are, and how thin the line is between civilization and the darkness that can be just beyond our understanding.